Have you ever imagined waking up in the middle of the night with a strange feeling, looking out the window and realizing there's something out there, something that shouldn't be there, watching your house? And worse, it's not interested in you, but in something inside your own house? Now tell me, why would someone, or something, cross unknown skies just to look for a simple cat? This story begins quietly, almost ornately. An elderly woman, living alone in a simple house on a quiet street where nothing extraordinary seemed to happen. The only constant sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall and the soft footsteps of her cat, who accompanied her like a faithful shadow. For her, that animal was not just company. It was family. It was presence. It was all that remained after a lifetime of losses. But there was something about that cat, something difficult to explain. He didn't behave like the others. Sometimes, he would spend hours staring into nothingness, or rather, staring at something she couldn't see. On other nights, he would stand near the window, watching the sky as if waiting for something. And the strangest thing of all was his gaze, a deep, almost human gaze, as if hiding a secret impossible to comprehend. Have you ever experienced this? Have you ever had the feeling that an animal knew more than it should? At first, she ignored it. After all, solitude can make the mind create things. But everything changed that night. The sky wasn't normal. There was a heavy silence in the air, as if the world had held its breath. And then, lights began to appear. They weren't ordinary lights like airplanes or stars. They were intense, pulsating, and moved in a way that defied all logic. It was at that moment that the cat reacted. He didn't hide. He didn't run. He just stood still, staring directly at those lights. And that's when the old woman felt it. A fear that didn't come from within, but from without. Something was coming. Something that didn't belong to that world. A few seconds later, a sound began. Low, vibrant, as if it were coming from everywhere at once. The walls of the house seemed to sense it. The air grew heavy. And then, a shadow crossed the window. It wasn't human. She tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. But when she heard the first impact on the door, everything changed. This wasn't a dream. This was real. And worse, he wasn't there by chance. They knew exactly where they were, and they knew what they wanted, the cat. But how could that be possible? What could a simple cat possibly have that's so important as to attract something so unknown? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you more than any story you've ever heard. Because that night wasn't just a visit, it was the beginning of a revelation that would change everything she believed about reality, and perhaps everything you believe in as well. Because what happened inside that house still can't be explained, and it's only just beginning. And while she was still trying to understand what was happening, her heart racing, her hands trembling, and her gaze fixed on that cat which, strangely, seemed calmer than ever, a different feeling began to emerge within her. It wasn't just fear. It was as if deep down, some part of her already knew that all of this had a greater meaning, because it didn't make sense. It never did. Why that cat? Why in that house? Why her of all houses? And it's precisely here that I want to extend an invitation to you, because this story, however frightening it may seem, can touch on something much deeper than just a mystery. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has caught your attention so far. Do you think this cat was just an ordinary animal? Or have you realized there's something more to it than that? I read many comments, and it's amazing how each person sees different details. Sometimes, someone notices something that goes unnoticed by everyone else, and that transforms the story into something alive, shared, almost as if we were trying to decipher it all together. And if you enjoy this kind of story, one that blends mystery, emotion, and that strange feeling that something is hidden in our world, go ahead and give it a like. It might seem simple, but it helps much more than you imagine. It's what makes this content reach more people who also feel that curiosity, that thrill, that desire to understand what cannot be explained. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, subscribe now. Because what happened here isn't an isolated case. There are other stories, other accounts, that may connect in ways we haven't even realized yet. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. And in the end, perhaps that's exactly what makes it all the more intriguing, realizing that you're not alone in feeling that something strange is watching, waiting, happening right under our noses. Because while all of this was going through her mind, while fear and doubt mingled within that small, silent space, what was outside did not recede. On the contrary, it seemed to be getting closer and closer. And at that moment, while something outside seemed to be getting closer and closer, it's impossible not to step back a little, because to understand what was really happening in that house, you need to know who that woman was, and especially who that cat was. She wasn't someone extraordinary in the eyes of the world. She was one of those people who go unnoticed in the hustle and bustle of everyday life. A simple lady, with a quiet routine, who had already lived more than most could imagine. Life hadn't been kind to her. Losses, farewells, silences, all of this accumulated over the years, until the house, once full of voices, became a place that was too quiet. And it was in that silence that he appeared. The cat appeared unexpectedly. On an ordinary afternoon, with nothing special happening, it was simply there, at the door, thin, with an intense yet serene gaze. She could have ignored it, as many would. She could have closed the door, but something in that look made her hesitate. And it was in that small, almost automatic gesture that everything began. She took the animal in, gave it food, a place to sleep, and without realizing it, began a new phase of her life. Because that cat wasn't just a companion. He filled a void that words can't explain. He was always nearby, always present, always attentive. But over time, small things started to catch my attention, things that at first seemed like insignificant details. The way he watched. It wasn't the ordinary gaze of a curious animal. It was as if he were analyzing, understanding, as if he understood her every movement, every emotion, every thought. Sometimes, even before she got up from her chair, he was already there, waiting, as if he knew exactly what she would do. And that started to stir something inside her, a strange feeling, difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. And that wasn't all. There were nights when he would simply disappear, without a sound, without warning. The door was closed, the windows too, but he would disappear. And hours later, or even the next day, I would return, as if nothing had happened, but it never came back the same. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there was something different. His gaze seemed deeper, his demeanor quieter, as if he carried something that hadn't been there before. Can you imagine living something like this every day? Because little by little, it stopped being just a common coexistence and began to transform into a kind of journey, one of those silent journeys that happen behind the scenes of life, where we begin to question our own reality. And there's one more detail that changes everything. The sky. The cat spent hours gazing at the sky, not randomly, but intently, as if waiting for something, as if there were an invisible connection between him and whatever was up there. And at first, she even found it curious. She would joke that he must be talking to the stars. But over time, that joke lost its appeal, because it no longer seemed like a coincidence. It seemed like a pattern. And it is precisely here that something deeper comes into play, something that goes beyond the story itself. Because when we begin to observe carefully, we realize that certain things in life don't happen by chance. There is a hidden truth behind unexpected encounters, improbable connections, presences that emerge precisely when everything seems empty. And perhaps, without realizing it, she made a decision that completely changed the course of her own story. The decision to open the door, to let in something she didn't understand. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what began as simple companionship gradually revealed signs, clues, small details that, when connected, begin to show that the cat wasn't there by chance, and that all of this was part of something much bigger, something that had been being prepared long before she realized it. And the more we observe these signs, the harder it becomes to ignore the impact they have, because at some point, reality begins to fold before our eyes, and that's exactly what started to happen. Comment below. This makes sense to me. And it was at that point that everything started to spiral out of control. Not explosively, not all at once, but gradually, as if reality was being altered behind the scenes, detail by detail, until it was no longer possible to pretend that nothing was happening. At first they were small things, almost insignificant. A glass she was sure she'd left on the table, turned up in the sink, a chair slightly out of place, the cupboard door ajar, even after she'd checked it 2 or 3 times before bed. Things Anyone would try to explain rationally, and that's exactly what she did. I must be forgetting, she thought, but deep down, she knew it wasn't just that, because along with these small events came a different feeling, a heaviness in the atmosphere, as if the house which was once just quiet was now occupied. And then, the lights came on. First, a slight flicker, a quick blink, nothing that drew much attention, but, as the days went by, it intensified. The lights flickered for no reason, sometimes all at once, other times just a specific room, usually the one where the cat was. And the strangest thing is that he always reacted first. Before the light even flickered, he was already lifting his head. Before any sound, he was already alert, as if it were connected to something she couldn't perceive. This started to affect her mindset in a profound way, because there comes a point when you have to make a decision, continue ignoring it, or face the truth, however uncomfortable it may be. And she tried to ignore it, but then came the whispers, bass, almost imperceptible. At first she thought it was all in her head, those sounds you hear when the house is in absolute silence, but these weren't like that. They had rhythm, they had intention, they were like distant voices and trying to break through some barrier, and they always happened at night, whenever everything was dark, whenever the cat was awake. He wasn't scared, he wasn't hiding. On the contrary, he seemed attentive. Sometimes he tilted his head as if he were listening. Other times he positioned himself in the middle of the room, staring at a blank space, completely still. And that's when something changed inside her, because at that moment, she stopped trying to explain. She began to observe. And when you change the way you look at things, you start to notice things that went unnoticed before. The cat wasn't just reacting, he was interacting. There were times when he seemed to follow, something invisible with his eyes, as if he were tracking movements in the air. At other times he would emit low sounds, different from a common meow, almost as if he were responding to something. And this had a strong emotional impact, because it wasn't just about fear anymore. It was about perception. It was about understanding that something was happening there, something that wasn't part of ordinary reality. And the more she tried to rationalize, the more the events intensified. The doors started making noise on their own. Objects were falling without explanation. And then, on one particular night, something happened that changed everything. She woke up with the feeling that she wasn't alone. It wasn't a thought, it was a physical feeling, as if there was someone or something inside the house. She slowly opened her eyes, her heart racing, and there was the cat, sitting in the middle of the room, staring intently into a dark corner. But this time, it wasn't just him watching. There was something there. She couldn't see clearly, but she could feel it, a presence, dense, silent, observing. And in that instant, everything made sense, and at the same time nothing else did, because when you realize there's something beyond what your eyes can see, there's no going back. Ignorance is no longer an option, and the truth, however frightening it may be, begins to reveal itself. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because these signs weren't random. They were part of a sequence, a pattern that was being built little by little, as if someone, or something, was preparing the ground for something bigger, something inevitable. And when you start connecting the dots, you realize that none of it was a coincidence. It was a process, a preparation, a revelation that was getting closer and closer to happening. Write this down. I would start to get suspicious too. And then, that night arrived, unlike the others, not silent, not predictable, but charged, with something different, almost as if the very air were announcing that something was about to happen. The feeling was dense, difficult to explain, like when you sense a change even before it manifests. And that's exactly what she felt, an inner warning, as if reality itself was about to shatter. The clock showed sometime in the early morning when it all began. First, absolute silence. No sound coming from the street, no wind, no insects, nothing, as if the world had been paused. And then, light. An intense light flooded the room, piercing through the cracks in the window with an almost impossible force. It wasn't ordinary light. It had no clear origin, no defined direction. It was as if it were everywhere at once, pulsating, alive. She stood up slowly, her heart racing, and approached the window. And that's when he saw it. The sky was no longer the same. Lights hovered above the house, moving with precision and coordination, as if obeying an invisible command. There was no engine noise, no logical explanation. It was something completely beyond what the human mind is accustomed to accepting. And at that moment, the cat was already there, sitting by the window, observing property, as if he had been waiting for that exact moment. And then, the sound began. It wasn't loud, but it was impossible to ignore. A deep, vibrant sound that seemed to pass through her body instead of just being heard, as if it were resonating inside her, stirring something deeper than just her senses. A sound that didn't seem to belong to this world. And along with him came the shadows. First, subtle ones, quick movements outside, difficult to distinguish, but gradually they began to form. Silhouettes, presences, figures that didn't move like humans, nor did they have a completely defined shape. They were there, around the house, observing, approaching, and it was at that moment that the truth began to assert itself in a brutal way. They weren't there by chance. They knew. They knew exactly where they were. They knew exactly what they wanted. The cat. A shiver ran through her body, not just from fear, but from understanding. All of it. The signs, the behaviors, the inexplicable events. It was all leading up to this moment. It was the point of convergence. The revelation that had been building behind the scenes was now unfolding before her eyes, and for the first time, the cat reacted differently. He turned to her, and in that look, there was something that had never been there before. Conscience. Not like an animal, but like something that understands, that knows, that chooses. And that changed everything, because at that moment, she no longer saw a cat. She saw someone who in some way was part of something much bigger than she could comprehend. And instinctively, she made a decision. She positioned herself in front of him, even without understanding, even without knowing what he was facing. It was a decision that came from a deep place, almost like a reflection of her own journey, because throughout her life, everything she had learned about loss, about love, about protection, led to that exact moment. She wasn't going to let them take away what was her only companion. But then, the door. A loud impact echoed through the house, then another one, and another. It wasn't human. It wasn't something I was trying to do cautiously. It was strength. It was precise. That was the intention. The walls vibrated, the windows trembled, and the shadows outside began to move more intensely, more coordinated, as if synchronized with something greater. And that's when her reality completely shattered, because there was no longer any doubt. That was not human. It didn't follow human logic. It had no human limits. And yet, it was there, at her front door, searching for something that, until recently, she believed to be just a simple animal. But now, everything made sense. Or perhaps, nothing else would happen. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what happened in the next few moments wasn't just an invasion. It was a direct revelation, unfiltered, undisguised. It was the moment when the hidden truth ceased to be a whisper and became impossible to ignore. And when that happens, there's no going back. Write this down. I would feel scared right then, and it was precisely there, at that point where fear could no longer be contained within her, that something unexpected happened, not outside, but inside the house itself. The sound coming from the door continued. The lights pulsed more intensely. The shadows stirred as if about to break through any barrier, but suddenly everything seemed to slow down, as if time had been stretched, as if that moment had been separated from the rest of the world. The cat took a step forward, and that, in itself, was already strange, because until then, he had only observed. But not now. Now there was intention in every movement. He walked slowly, to the center of the room, completely ignoring the chaos around him, and then he stopped, and he looked at her. But it wasn't an ordinary look. It was unlike anything she had ever seen before. It was deep, heavy, almost impossible to sustain. And at that moment something happened that cannot be explained logically. She understood, not with words, not with sound, but with a clarity that pierced any doubt, as if a hidden truth had been revealed directly within her mind, as if, for a brief moment, she had access to something that had always been hidden in the background of reality. That cat was never just a cat. He was something more, something that didn't belong in that world, a presence, an entity, or perhaps a messenger. And the more this understanding formed within her, the more everything began to fall into place. The glances, the disappearances, the behaviors, the signs, none of it was random. It was part of a process, a silent journey that had been underway since the moment he appeared at her door. But why? That was the question that echoed within her, and the answer came, not as a complete explanation, but as a feeling. He was there for her, not by chance, not out of necessity, but by choice. And this had such a strong emotional impact that, for a moment, the fear simply disappeared, because it all stopped being about invasion and became about connection, regarding presence, about something that somehow silently accompanied her, protecting her, observing her, perhaps even guiding decisions she didn't even realize. And then he approached, slowly, no rush, as if every second mattered. He stopped right in front of her and tilted his head slightly. And in that simple gesture, there was an intensity impossible to describe. It was goodbye, but not an ordinary goodbye. It was one of those moments where no words are necessary, because everything has already been said in other ways. A silence laden with meaning. An instant where time seems to stop, just so that it can be fully felt. And she understood. He understood that he couldn't stop it. He understood that this was part of something bigger, from something that was beyond human decisions, because even though he had chosen to stay, now he had to go. And that was the hardest part. It wasn't fear. It wasn't the unknown. It was a loss. Once again, but this time, with something she never fully understood. And even then, it hurt. She tried to get closer, tried to touch it, but hesitated, not out of fear, but out of respect, because deep down she knew that it wasn't just an animal, and that this moment needed to happen the way it was happening, without interference, without resistance, just being there. And then, he did something that changed everything. For the first time, he looked away, and he walked towards the door, and, as if responding to an invisible command, the impacts ceased, the sound disappeared, the lights stabilized, and the silence returned, but not like before. It was a different kind of silence, loaded, denso, as if something very important had just happened. And in that instant, she realized that the journey that began with a simple encounter at her doorstep was never simple. It was always part of something much bigger, something that was now beginning to reveal itself more clearly, but still incomplete. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what happened after that moment wasn't just a farewell. It was the direct consequence of everything that had been building up from the beginning. It was the real impact of that revelation and what it left behind, because some presences leave, but they never truly disappear. Comment below, I wouldn't let him go. And after he walked through that door, everything stopped. There was no explosion, no dramatic farewell, no grand scene like you see in stories. It was simple, silent, almost natural, as if it had been defined from the beginning, as if every step of that journey had been precisely calculated behind the scenes of something she would never fully understand. The lights in the sky disappeared as quickly as they had appeared. The sound stopped. The shadows disappeared, and the house was returned to exactly how it was before, or at least, it seemed that way, because the silence that remained there was no longer the same. It wasn't the silence of solitude. It was a silence laden with presence, with memory, with something that still echoed in the walls, in the air, inside her. She remained still for a few seconds, maybe minutes, maybe longer. Time at that moment no longer made much sense. Her body was there, but her mind was still trying to process everything that had happened. And then, little by little, reality began to reorganize itself. The room, the furniture, the clock on the wall, ticking away the time as if nothing had happened. But she knew. I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. And perhaps that's the most profound part of this story, because there are moments in life that don't transform what's outside, but completely change what's inside. They change the way you see the world, how you interpret signs, how you understand your own existence. And that was one of those moments. She walked slowly to the door, which was still ajar. He looked outside. Nothing. No trace. No sign. No proof. If someone had arrived there at that moment, they would never have believed what had happened. And that brought a strange feeling, because at the same time that everything seemed to have returned to normal, there was a truth there, A truth that didn't need proof, didn't need explanation, didn't need to be validated by anyone. She had lived through that, and that was enough. She closed the door, and for the first time in a long time, the house didn't seem empty. This may seem contradictory, but it makes sense when you truly understand the impact of this experience. Because even without the cat's physical presence, something was there. Something that remained. Something that didn't go away with him. A brand, an energy, a memory that wasn't just a recollection. It was a feeling, and that completely changed her mindset. Because that woman who once felt alone, now knew. Did you know that at some point in her life she wasn't just accompanied, she was connected to something much bigger? Something that chose to be there. Something he noticed. Something that, in some way, took care of it. And this raises a question that goes beyond this story. A question that might change the way you see the world from now on. What if what we consider simple isn't so simple after all? What if there are presences all around us, disguised in the most common forms? What if, at some point in your life, something or someone was close to you, observing, following, influencing, without you even realizing it? This is not just a story about an old woman and a cat. It's about perception, regarding decisions, about seeing beyond the obvious. Because often the hidden truth isn't concealed in distant places. It's exactly where we least expect it, in everyday life. Not common, not that people ignore. And maybe, just maybe, we're not as alone as we think. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because when you start to analyze all of this carefully, you realize that there are patterns, signs, and experiences that repeat themselves in different contexts, different lives, as if there were something bigger connecting all of this in a silent, almost invisible way. And that's when this story stops being just a narrative and becomes an invitation to observe, to question, to awaken, because in the end, what seems like fiction to some may just be a part of reality that hasn't been fully understood yet. Comment below. I don't see the world the same way anymore, and if you've made it this far, it's because somehow this story captivated you. Perhaps not just because of the mystery, but because of what it awakens inside. Because when something makes us think, question, or even feel that slight shiver of, what if this is real? It's a sign that it has touched a deeper place. So if you want to continue exploring this type of story, one that goes beyond the surface, that brings these reflections and possible revelations hidden in everyday life, you can subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss the upcoming content that follows exactly this line. Always connecting mystery, emotion, and that feeling that there's something more happening. And tell me something. If you stayed with me until the end, write in the comments, I'm with you until the end. This helps us understand who really connects with this type of content and creates a community of people who see beyond the obvious. If at any point in this story you felt something different, curiosity, tension, reflection, leave a like on the video. It's a simple way to show that this type of narrative makes sense to you and that it's worth continuing to bring more. And before you leave, there's a video here that perfectly complements this kind of topic. It goes even deeper into the ideas we've started exploring here. Click and continue watching, because the more you observe, the more things start to make sense.